The assembly hall was the largest structure ever built by living hands. It floated above the planet Verath Prime like a second moon, its walls made of a crystal-like material that let in the soft blue light of the system's star. Inside, hundreds of alien species sat in their designated seats, arranged in a circle so wide that the beings on the far side looked like tiny moving dots. The air inside was carefully mixed, just the right amount of every gas that every species needed to breathe. The temperature was divided into zones, from the freezing cold sections where the HFY sat wrapped in their thick gray fur, to the warm, humid corners where the Cethara curled their long bodies on heated platforms. This was the Galactic Conclave, the greatest gathering of minds in the known universe. 212 species, spread across thousands of star systems, all united under one roof to talk, argue, trade, and, at least in theory, protect one another. It had existed for over 4,000 years. Today, for the first time in its entire history, it was afraid. Ambassador Drevik of the Vorath stood at the central podium. He was tall, with pale silver skin and 4 arms that he kept folded tightly against his chest. His species had been part of the conclave for 3,000 years. They had seen wars. They had seen plagues. They had seen entire star systems go dark. But Drevik had never stood at this podium with sweat on his palms before today. He cleared his throat and looked out at the sea of alien faces. "The Krethval have sent a formal message," he said. His voice was calm. Trained diplomats always sounded calm, even when everything was falling apart. It arrived 6 hours ago on all frequencies, in all known languages, including several we did not think they were aware of. The hall was completely silent, not the silence of peace, the silence of held breath. "Their demand is simple," Drevik continued. "All inhabited worlds under conclave protection are to submit to what they call a harvesting process. They require our resources, our planets, and in many cases, our populations. They have given us 30 cycles to respond. If we do not respond with full agreement, they will begin with the nearest system and move inward." Someone in the back made a sound. It was not a word. It was just a sound, the kind a creature makes when it hears something too horrible to process. Drevik let the silence sit for a moment before he continued. "The Krethval are not a new threat. They have been expanding for 800 years. In that time they have consumed 42 civilizations. Some of those civilizations were members of the Conclave. Most of them were not. In every single case, no resistance was successful. No alliance stopped them. No weapon slowed them. They are not an empire in the way we understand the word. They do not want to rule. They do not want to negotiate. They want only to consume." He paused. "Our Defense Council has been in session since the message arrived. Their conclusion is that we do not have the military capability to stop a Krethval invasion. Our combined fleet, if fully assembled and perfectly coordinated, has perhaps a 12% chance of delaying their advance by 2 or 3 cycles. Not stopping it, delaying it." The murmuring that rose from the crowd was low and frightened. "The Council recommends that we begin drafting terms of conditional surrender. It is believed that if we offer our cooperation willingly, the Krethval may be persuaded to preserve a portion of each species. A remnant, a remainder." The word remainder hung in the air like smoke. From the back of the human section, a woman stood up. Her name was Commander Yara Osai. She was the senior human representative to the Galactic Conclave, a position that carried a lot of responsibility but, until recently, very little real power. Humanity had been admitted to the Conclave 40 years ago after making first contact with the Verath. They had been welcomed politely and assigned the status of Class C Provisional Member, which was the Conclave's quiet way of saying you are too young and too primitive to matter yet. Humanity had accepted this with a smile. Osai was a compact woman with dark brown skin and short natural hair going gray at the temples. She wore the simple gray uniform of the Earth Diplomatic Corps. She had no elaborate robes, no ceremonial markings, none of the decorative layers that most senior representatives wore in this hall. She looked plain. She looked simple. She did not look afraid. "Ambassador Drevik," she said. Her voice carried easily across the chamber. The translation systems picked it up and converted it into 200 languages instantly. "I have a question." Drevik looked at her with something between surprise and mild irritation. "This is not the time for open questions, Commander. We are in the middle of a—" "My question," she said, as if he had not spoken, "is whether the Council's recommendation has been formally adopted, or whether it is still a recommendation." Drevik blinked. "It is still a recommendation, technically, but then it has not been decided." "Commander Osai." Drevik's voice took on the particular tone that senior diplomats used when they needed someone lower ranked to sit down and stop talking. "I understand that this news is difficult. It is difficult for all of us. But humanity has been part of this conclave for only 40 years. With the greatest respect, your species does not yet have the experience or the perspective to—" "We don't need perspective," Osai said. "We need a decision." She walked forward. The other human delegates shifted in their seats. A few of them looked nervous. One of the younger ones looked excited, which probably said something about the difference between people who had been in diplomacy for a long time and people who had not. Osai reached the floor of the main chamber and stood at the base of the central podium. She did not ask for permission to speak from the primary position. She simply stood there and waited until Drevik, after a long and uncomfortable pause, stepped to the side. She looked out at the 212 species of the galactic conclave. "My name is Yara Osai," she said. "I represent Earth. I represent humanity. I have listened to everything that has been said in this chamber today. I have read the Defense Council's report. I have looked at the numbers." She paused. "And I want to say something very clearly so that the translation systems have no trouble with it." The hall was absolutely still. "Humanity does not negotiate with those who have already decided to destroy us," she said. "Humanity does not write surrender documents. Humanity does not offer itself as a remainder." She let the word land hard. "We have a different word for what the Krethval are doing. We have had that word for a very long time. We call it a threat. And humanity has a specific and well-practiced response to threats." A Voreth senior diplomat, too, rose back, leaned over to the Sethara delegate beside him and whispered, "Is she seriously suggesting that humanity is going to fight the Krethval alone?" The Sethara delegate whispered back, "I think she might be. They'll be wiped out in hours." "Yes," the Sethara agreed sadly, "poor things." Osai could not hear them, but she had heard variations of that conversation her entire career. She had been hearing it since the day humanity first walked into this building and was given a seat in the back row. "I'm not going to stand here and tell you that humanity can solve this problem alone," she said. "That is not what I am saying. What I am saying is that humanity will not be part of any conversation about surrender. Not today, not ever. If the rest of the conclave chooses to pursue that path, that is your choice. But Earth's answer to the Krethval is no. A clear, simple, permanent no." She looked directly at Drevik. "So before this body votes on any recommendation," she said, "I would ask that the record shows humanity's position. Whatever happens next, it should be known that we did not agree. We did not bend. And we did not help write the document that handed the galaxy over to something that eats worlds." She turned and walked back to her seat. The chamber erupted. Hundreds of species talking at once, the translation system struggling to keep up, the noise becoming a wall of sound that echoed off the crystal walls and filled the chamber from floor to ceiling. Some delegates were angry. Some were frightened. Some were staring at the human section with expressions that, depending on the species, meant something between respect and deep, genuine pity. Ambassador Drevik stood at the podium for a long moment without speaking. Then he said, very quietly, "The human position has been noted for the record." Outside the assembly hall, in the long, transparent corridor that connected the main chamber to the delegate quarters, a young Vereth aide named Thas caught up with Commander Osai. Thas was barely 30 years old by Vereth counting, and he had been working in the Conclave administration for only 2 years. He was, as most young Verath were, tall and thin, with pale eyes that were slightly too large for his face. "Commander," he said, falling into step beside her. She glanced at him. "I wanted to ask," he said carefully, "what you said in there, did you mean it, all of it?" "Yes," she said. "But the numbers," Thas said. "The Defense Council's numbers, you saw them. 12% chance of delay, not even." "I saw them." "Then how, I mean, what is Earth's actual plan?" He hesitated. "Do you have a plan, or was that just a statement?" Osai stopped walking. She turned and looked at the young aide for a moment. Then something changed in her expression. It was not quite a smile. It was smaller than that and quieter, and in some ways more serious than anything she had shown in the chamber. "Thas," she said, "how long have humans been part of this conclave?" 40 years, he said. "And in those 40 years, what did you think we were doing?" He blinked, adjusting, learning, integrating into galactic society. We provided technology assistance, trade frameworks, the standard new member. "What did you think we were doing at home?" she said. He opened his mouth, then closed it. She held his gaze for a moment longer. Then she turned and kept walking. Thas stood in the corridor alone. He thought about that question for a long time. He thought about the fact that humanity had been smiling politely for 40 years. He thought about how large human industrial output actually was numbers he had seen in trade reports, but never really considered. He thought about the fact that no conclave survey ship had ever been invited to observe the outer edges of the human home system. He thought about all of this. And for the first time since the Krethval message arrived, he felt something that was not exactly hope. It was stranger than hope. It was closer to the particular feeling of realizing that you had been in a room with something very large and very quiet, and you had not noticed it until just now. He walked back to his office. He pulled up every trade record, every resource report, every logged shipping route originating from human space for the past 4 decades. He read through the night. By morning, his hands were shaking. The Uit cloud was the loneliest place in the solar system. It was not a place anyone could see with the naked eye. It was not a place anyone thought about unless they had a very specific reason to. It sat at the far outer edge of the solar system, a vast and dark shell of frozen rock and ice and silence, so far from the sun that the sun itself looked like nothing more than a slightly brighter star. Nothing lived there. Nothing passed through there. No trade routes crossed it. No conclave survey ship had ever been asked to go near it. That was the point. 41 years ago, 3 months after humanity's first official meeting with the Verath, and 2 months before Earth formally applied for conclave membership, a woman named Dr. Lena Vasquez sat in a small government office in Geneva and wrote a 7-page document. The document had no official title. In the internal filing system, it was listed simply as Contingency Review, External Threat Assessment. It was read by 11 people. 9 of them signed it. The other 2 asked for more time to think, and were gently reminded that time was the one thing the document specifically said humanity did not have. The document said something simple. It said that the galaxy was not safe. It said that joining the conclave would give humanity knowledge, trade, and a seat at a large and impressive table, but that a seat at a table was not the same as protection. It said that the history of every civilization humanity had ever studied, including its own, pointed to one unavoidable truth. The only guarantee of survival was the ability to defend yourself. It said that humanity needed to build something, quietly, without asking permission, without telling anyone. The document said that if humanity was wrong, and the galaxy turned out to be perfectly safe, then the project would be a waste of resources that no one outside a small group would ever know about. But if humanity was right, if the galaxy turned out to be the same as every other environment humanity had ever encountered, full of danger dressed up in polite clothing, then the project might be the most important thing the human race had ever done. 9 signatures, that was all it took. The project was called Iron Covenant. In the first 5 years, it was almost nothing. A few automated mining platforms sent to the outer Uit cloud, listed in trade records as experimental deep space resource extraction. A handful of engineers who officially retired from their government jobs and unofficially went somewhere that was not listed in any public directory. A small amount of funding that moved through so many different accounts that tracking it would have taken a forensic team several years and a great deal of patience. But it grew. In the second decade, the platforms multiplied. What had been a handful became dozens, then hundreds. Long transport chains moved raw materials inward in the dark, passed them through relays hidden inside unremarkable asteroid clusters, and fed them into construction zones so far from any inhabited body that even Earth's own civilian population had no idea they existed. The engineers who went there did not come back. Not because they were not allowed to, but because the work was too important and too large, and after a few years, most of them had stopped thinking of themselves as people who had left something behind. They had become people who were building something. Their children were born in those facilities. They grew up under artificial light, in long rotating habitat rings that simulated gravity, learning mathematics and engineering before they could fully read. They did not think of this as unusual. It was simply the world they knew. Their parents told them what they were building and why, and the children accepted it the way children accept most things told to them by people they trust completely. In the third decade, the shape of what was being built became clear. It was a warship. Not a warship the way the Conclave understood warships. Conclave military vessels were elegant things, long and narrow, built for energy weapons and precision strikes, designed by species who had spent thousands of years refining the art of targeted minimal destruction combat. They were impressive. They were advanced. They were built by civilizations that had, for the most part, stopped thinking about war as something that could threaten their survival. For them, war was a tool of policy, a controlled instrument. Humanity had a different relationship with war. For most of recorded human history, war had not been a tool of policy. It had been a matter of survival. Humanity had spent thousands of years trying to kill itself, and in doing so had learned things about destruction, endurance, and adaptation under fire that no other species in the Conclave had ever needed to learn. Humanity knew how to build weapons that were not elegant, weapons that were not precise, weapons that were designed for one purpose and one purpose only: to keep hitting until there was nothing left to hit. The ship they built carried that knowledge in every plate of its hull. It was named the ESV Unyielding Earth. It was over 4 kilometers long. Its hull was layered in a composite material that did not exist anywhere in Conclave records, developed by 3 generations of human metallurgists working in total isolation. It had 16 primary weapon systems, none of which were energy-based. It carried kinetic mass drivers that could accelerate a solid metal rod to a significant fraction of the speed of light. It carried nuclear-tipped torpedoes designed not to explode on impact, but to penetrate deep into a target before detonating. It carried drone swarms controlled by an artificial intelligence system that could learn and adapt in real time, rewriting its own tactical programs mid-battle based on what it observed. It also carried a crew of 4,211 men and women, most of whom had been born in the Uit cloud and had never set foot on Earth. But the unyielding Earth was not alone. By the time the Krethval message reached the Galactic Conclave, Iron Covenant had produced 141 ships. Not all of them were as large as the unyielding Earth. Some were smaller, faster, designed for different roles. But all of them were built on the same principles. All of them carried the same philosophy pressed into their steel bones. Do not stop, do not retreat, do not give the enemy a moment to breathe. The crews of those ships had been training for decades. They trained in simulations so realistic that veterans sometimes woke from sleep in a cold sweat, unable to remember for a moment whether the battle they were dreaming about was real or not. They trained against each other in exercises that the Conclave's military theorists would have called reckless, because they were not designed to minimize casualties. They were designed to teach people how to keep functioning when everything was going wrong. how to make decisions when half the information they needed was missing, how to fight when they were losing. A conclave admiral, if one had been watching, would have been deeply uncomfortable. Military doctrine across most of the galaxy valued coordination, hierarchy, and controlled response. Every ship in a conclave fleet was expected to wait for orders before acting. This kept battles organized and predictable. It also meant that if the chain of command broke down, the whole fleet froze. Human doctrine was different. Every captain, every officer, every crew member was trained to act independently. They were given objectives, not instructions. They were told what needed to happen and trusted to figure out how to make it happen themselves. A human fleet was not a single controlled machine. It was a collection of individuals, each one capable of functioning alone, each one trained to keep moving even when the person above them in the chain of command was gone. It was messy. It was loud. It was, by conclave standards, deeply undisciplined. It was also nearly impossible to stop, because you could not decapitate it. There was no single point of failure. On the morning that Commander Osai made her statement in the conclave chamber, a young engineer named Dara Mensa was in the engine room of the unyielding Earth, running a final diagnostic on the ship's third primary drive. She was 23 years old. She had never seen a real star without a viewport between herself and it. She had never walked on grass. She had grown up in the Uit cloud, learning the ship the way children on Earth learned their neighborhoods, room by room and system by system, until she could walk its corridors in total darkness and never lose her way. Her mother had worked on the ship's hull plating. Her grandmother had helped design the drive system she was now testing. 3 generations, 1 ship. She heard the announcement over the internal comm when it came. The comm officer read out the short version. The Krethval had issued an extinction ultimatum to the conclave. Commander Os had refused on behalf of Earth. The fleet was being placed on full readiness. Dara put down her diagnostic tool. She sat very still for a moment. Then she picked the tool back up and went back to work. Around her, in every section of the ship, the same thing was happening. Engineers finished their checks. Weapons crews ran their calibrations one more time. Pilots sat in their stations and quietly reviewed the tactical scenarios they had been simulating for years. Medical staff prepared their stations, not with panic, not with speeches. They had known this moment was coming. They had been built for this moment, just as the ship had been built for it, and they faced it the way you face something you have spent your whole life preparing for. With steady hands, with clear eyes. 3 days after Osai's statement, the conclave received a second message from the Krethval. It was shorter than the first. It said that humanity's refusal had been noted. It said that Earth would be the first world consumed, as an example to the others. Ambassador Drevik brought the message to Osai personally. He stood in her small office off the main corridor of the delegate quarters and read it to her from a data screen, his voice careful and neutral. When he finished, he looked at her and waited. She was looking out the viewport at the stars. "Commander," he said quietly, "is there anything Earth can actually do, truly? I am not asking to be difficult. I am asking because if there is something, anything, the conclave should know about it." She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Tell me something, Ambassador. When the conclave admitted humanity 40 years ago, did anyone ever send a survey ship to our outer system?" He frowned slightly. "I don't believe so. The standard survey requirements for new members cover the inner system only. Why?" "No reason," she said. She turned from the window and looked at him directly. "Tell the conclave to hold their surrender documents for a little while longer," she said. "Tell them to wait." "Wait for what?" She almost smiled. "You'll know," she said, "when you see it." The Krethval advance fleet came in from the dark like a slow storm. 4,000 warships. Each one was roughly the size of a small moon. They moved in a wide formation that covered so much space it took several minutes for long-range sensors to finish mapping the full shape of it. There was no attempt at stealth. No hiding. The Krethval did not hide. They had never needed to. They moved the way a landslide moves, not fast, but with the absolute certainty of something that cannot be stopped, something that does not consider the possibility of failure because it has never experienced it. They entered the outer rim 3 days after the deadline passed. The first world in their path was a small colony called Verath 7, home to about 200,000 Verath settlers. It had no military defenses. It had a single orbital station used for trade and a communication relay tower on its largest continent. When the Krethval fleet appeared on its sensors, the station sent out a distress signal to the Conclave and then went completely silent. No one on the station tried to fight. There was nothing to fight with. They simply sent the signal and waited. The Conclave received the distress call in the main assembly chamber. By then the chamber had become something close to a permanent emergency session, with most delegates staying in or near their seats at all hours, sleeping in shifts, eating at their stations. The large central display screen that normally showed star maps and trade routes had been switched to a live tactical feed showing the Krethval fleet's position, updated every few minutes by sensor buoys scattered across the outer rim. The dots on the screen were moving steadily inward. Thas stood at the back of the Verath delegation section and watched the screen with dry eyes. He had not slept properly in 4 days. Since the night he had spent going through every human trade record and resource report he could find, he had been trying to make sense of what he had discovered. The numbers were strange. Not wrong exactly, but strange in the way that a shadow is strange when it does not match the shape of the thing casting it. Humanity's reported industrial output was not remarkable. It was solid for a Class C member, slightly above average, nothing that raised flags. But when Thas looked at the raw materials flowing into human space over the last 4 decades, the metals, the composite chemicals, the fuel compounds, the quantities of certain specialized alloys that had no obvious civilian application, the numbers did not match the reported output. There was too much going in. Far too much, spread across too many years, moving through too many quiet little trade channels that none of the Conclave's standard monitoring systems had been built to flag. Something had been consuming those materials. Something very large. He had brought his findings to his supervisor, a senior Verath administrator named Kors, who had looked at the numbers for a long time and then said, very carefully, that it was probably a data anomaly, and that Thas should focus on more pressing matters given the current situation. Thas did not think it was a data anomaly, but he had no idea what it actually was, and so he stood at the back of the chamber and watched the screen and waited, the same way Commander Osai had told Ambassador Drevik to wait, though Thas did not know that. Then, on the morning of the 4th day after the deadline, every sensor buoy in the outer solar system of Earth simultaneously registered something new. Not one something, many somethings. The alert came through on every screen in the conclave chamber at the same time. A soft chime, the kind the system used when new data required immediate attention, and then a cluster of readings that the tactical display struggled to organize because it had never encountered anything quite like them before. Objects were emerging from the far outer edge of the human solar system. They were moving at a velocity that the system flagged immediately as an error. Because the velocity it was reading did not seem possible for objects of the size it was also reading, the computer ran its calculations 3 times in rapid succession. Then it displayed the results and stopped trying to explain them. 141 objects, each between 1 and 4 kilometers in length, moving at a speed that should have been, by every known engineering standard, completely impossible for anything that large. The chamber went from quiet tension to full chaos in about 10 seconds. Delegates were out of their seats. Multiple species were shouting in their own languages simultaneously, and the translation systems, which could normally handle any amount of overlapping speech, began producing garbled outputs because the words were coming too fast and too many of them were the same word in different languages. That word, roughly translated across most of the species present, meant impossible. Ambassador Drevik stood at the central podium with both hands gripping the edges of it and stared at the screen. His silver skin had gone several shades paler. He opened his mouth, closed it, and then opened it again. "What," he said very quietly, "is that?" From her seat in the human section, Commander Osai stood up. She straightened her gray jacket. She picked up the data screen from the seat beside her and walked to the floor of the chamber with the same unhurried step she always used, the step of someone who was not performing calm but actually felt it. She stood in the center of the floor and looked up at the tactical display. "That," she said, "is the answer to your question, Ambassador." The room slowly became quiet, not because people stopped being afraid, but because something about her voice, about the simple, steady way she said it, reached through the noise and pulled attention toward her the way a single clear note cuts through a crowd. "Those are human ships," she said. "They have been under construction for 40 years in the Oort cloud of our solar system. They were built for exactly this kind of situation. They are moving to intercept the Krethval advance fleet." The silence that followed was the deepest the chamber had produced in 4 days of crisis. Then a HFY delegate near the front said, in a low, rumbling voice that the translator rendered as a kind of disbelieving whisper, 141 ships against 4,000. "Yes," Osai said. "That is not a fleet," the HFY said. "That is a gesture." Osai looked at him. "You might be right," she said, "or you might be about to learn something new about us. Either way, I suggest everyone watch carefully." On the tactical display, the 141 human ships were arranging themselves. They had spread into a formation that an elderly Verath historian sitting in the third row recognized with a sudden, cold shock. He had seen that formation in old records, in the accounts of wars so old that most species considered them mythology. It was a total engagement posture, not a defensive arrangement, not a formation designed to protect anything or hold any particular position. It was the formation of a force that intended to close the full distance to the enemy, and not stop until one side no longer existed. The historian stood up without meaning to, knocking his data screen to the floor. Several delegates near him turned to look. "That pattern," he said, mostly to himself, "that is an extinction prevention formation. That means," he stopped. He sat back down slowly. "That means they are not planning to fight the advance fleet. They are planning to destroy it entirely, every ship." The delegate beside him, a young Sethara, said, "Can they do that? Against 4,000 Krethval warships?" The historian did not answer. He was staring at the screen. On board the unyielding Earth, Captain Ren Akafer sat in the command chair on the bridge and watched the Krethval fleet's position on his tactical screen. He was 54 years old, broad-shouldered, with a calm face that had settled long ago into an expression of permanent, quiet focus. He had been born on the ship. He had trained on this bridge since he was 14 years old. He had run simulations of this exact scenario more times than he could count, in every variation the tactical AI could generate, against enemies of every possible configuration and strength. He was not calm because he was not afraid. He was calm because fear was a thing he had already worked through years ago, in the long dark of the Oort cloud, and what was left on the other side of it was just clarity. He pressed the calm button on his armrest. "All crew," he said. "This is the captain. We are 22 hours from weapons range. Everything we were built for starts now. Do your jobs, trust each other, bring us through." He released the button. Around him, the bridge crew returned to their stations without a word. They checked their systems, confirmed their readings, and prepared. There were no speeches, no dramatic declarations. These were people who had spent their entire lives getting ready for this. They did not need to be inspired. They were already exactly where they had always been heading. In the engine room, Dara Mensa checked her drive readings one more time and found them perfect. She allowed herself one small, quiet breath. Then she went back to monitoring her board. The Krethval Supreme Commander, a being called Voth Charon, received the human fleet's approach on his command deck 6 hours after they left the solar system. He stood very still and looked at the readings for a long time. His species communicated partly through physical stillness. The more still a Krethval became, the more intensely it was thinking. His advisors around him were also very still. Then one of them moved slightly and said, "They are coming to meet us." "Yes," Voth Charon said. 141 ships. "Yes." "Against 4,000. Voth Charon did not answer this. He looked at the formation the human ships were holding. He had been a commander for 300 years. He had consumed 42 civilizations. He had never seen a species respond to his fleet this way. Not with this formation. Not moving at this speed. Not with this particular quality of directness that his sensors could not quite measure, but that he could feel in some deep instinctive part of himself. He had expected defiance. Defiance was common. Every species had individuals who refused to accept reality when reality was too large to face. This did not feel like defiance. This felt like something else, something older. He searched his memory, 300 years of campaigns and civilizations, and could not find the right word for it. His species did not have the word. They had never needed it. A transmission arrived from the lead human vessel. It was short. No demands, no threats, no request for negotiation. Just 2 pieces of data, a precise timestamp marking the exact moment the human fleet would enter weapons range of the Krethval Advance Fleet, and a 3-word message that the translator rendered cleanly. Voth Charon read it once. He stood very still for a very long time. Then quietly he said to no one in particular, "What have we come to?" His advisors exchanged looks. No one answered. Back in the conclave chamber, the entire assembly was watching the tactical display in silence. The 2 fleets were closing the distance between them steadily, one like a slow, unstoppable tide, the other like something thrown from a very great distance with very great force toward a very specific target. The numbers were not close. They had never been close. Any military analyst in the room could have told you what the numbers said. But Thas, standing at the back, looking at the formation, looking at the speed, looking at the 3-word message that was now being displayed in the corner of the tactical screen, "We remember everything," felt the thing he had felt in the corridor 4 days ago come back, stronger this time. It was not hope exactly. It was the feeling of realizing that the large, quiet thing in the room had finally stood up. And it was much, much bigger than anyone had thought. Nobody slept in the conclave chamber that night. The delegates stayed in their seats or stood in small, quiet groups near the walls, eyes fixed on the large tactical display at the center of the room. Food was brought in and mostly left untouched. The soft hum of the station's life support systems was the only sound for long stretches of time. Outside the crystal walls, the stars sat still and indifferent, the way they always did, caring nothing for the things happening between them. The 2 fleets closed the distance slowly, then less slowly, then in the final hours before contact, very fast indeed. Ambassador Drevik had not left the chamber in 2 days. He stood at the edge of the main floor with his 4 arms folded and watched the screen with the expression of a man who had stopped trying to predict what he was seeing and was simply trying to keep up with it. Beside him, the HFY delegate who had called the human fleet a gesture 3 days ago had not spoken since. He stood with his thick gray arms at his sides and his large pale eyes fixed on the display, and he had the look of someone quietly revising everything he thought he knew. Thas had found a seat near the back. He had a data screen on his lap that he had stopped looking at hours ago. He was just watching, just waiting. The first contact happened at 3:40 station time. The display lit up. What followed was not what most of the delegates expected. They had seen records of conclave fleet engagements before. Those battles had a certain shape. 2 forces would approach each other, exchange long-range energy fire, maneuver carefully, and gradually one side would lose enough ships to make continuing impractical and would pull back. It was organized. It was almost geometric. There were pauses, regroupings, long stretches of tactical repositioning, where nothing much happened while commanders on both sides recalculated. This was not that. The human fleet did not slow down when it reached weapons range. It did not form a line and begin exchanging fire at a respectful distance. It went straight in. All 141 ships pushed forward at full speed directly into the body of the Krethval formation, and within the first 4 minutes of contact, the tactical display was so filled with movement and weapons fire that the conclave system had to reduce its scale 3 times just to fit everything on screen. A young Sethara analyst sitting at one of the monitoring stations near the front of the chamber looked at her readings and said, loudly enough for several people nearby to hear, "They are not trying to hold a line. They are trying to break through the middle." "Break through to what?" the delegate beside her asked. "The command ships," she said. "They are going for the command ships first." This caused a ripple of murmuring through the nearby seats. Going for command ships early was not standard doctrine. Standard doctrine said you weakened the enemy's fighting strength first, reduced their numbers, and then targeted command structures once you had the advantage. Going for command ships at the start, while the enemy fleet was fully intact and fully capable, was considered reckless, suicidal even. Unless, a quiet voice in Thassa's head said, you had a fleet that did not depend on its own command structure the way the enemy depended on theirs. He leaned forward in his seat. On the display, the human ships were moving in a way that was genuinely difficult to follow. They were not moving as a single unit. They were not moving as a coordinated group following a central plan. They were moving as individuals, each ship making its own decisions, cutting its own path through the Krethval formation, and yet somehow not colliding, not blocking each other, fitting together in the chaos, the way pieces of a shattered thing still carry the memory of their original shape. The Krethval adapted. They were very good at adapting. 4,000 years of campaigns had made them extraordinarily good at reading a battle and adjusting to it. Within the first hour, they had identified the human approach pattern and begun rerouting their formation to cut off the push toward the command ships. They pulled ships from the outer edges of their fleet and funneled them inward, creating a wall between the human attackers and the vulnerable core. It was a smart move. Against most opponents, it would have worked. The humans adjusted faster. The ships that had been pushing toward the center suddenly split. Some continued inward. Others turned outward and began engaging the ships that had been pulled from the edges, which were now moving through open space without the support of the ships that had originally been beside them. The Krethval wall was being built from pieces that were being attacked before they reached their positions. Drevik watched this and felt something cold move through him. Not fear exactly. More like the particular feeling of watching someone do something you did not know was possible and understanding, in that moment, that your picture of what was possible had been wrong for a very long time. They planned for this, he said quietly. They planned for exactly this response. The HFY beside him said nothing, but his ears, which had been pressed flat against his broad head for the last hour, moved slightly forward. It was a very small movement. In HFY body language it meant, I am paying very close attention. The second hour was harder to watch. Human ships started taking damage. The Krethval weapons were powerful, and 4,000 ships firing produced a volume of fire that was very difficult to avoid completely. The display began showing red damage indicators on human vessels. Several ships lost significant portions of their hulls. One smaller human vessel, a fast attack ship near the outer edge of the engagement, was hit twice in rapid succession and went dark on the display. The chamber made a sound when that happened, a collective intake of breath from 200 species. But the other human ships near the damaged vessel did not stop. They did not slow down. 2 of them shifted angle slightly, putting their undamaged sides toward the area of heaviest fire and kept moving. The message that sent was so clear that it needed no translation. We are not stopping. Not for damage. Not for losses. Not for anything. An elderly Verath historian in the third row was documenting everything he saw on his data screen with shaking hands. He had spent his career studying old wars, wars from before the Conclave, wars that most modern species considered barbaric and incomprehensible. He had read about sieges that lasted decades, about soldiers who kept fighting with wounds that should have stopped them, about battles where both sides took catastrophic losses and neither one retreated because retreat was not something either side had decided was an option. He had always thought those accounts were exaggerated. He had always assumed that real beings, when faced with truly devastating losses, made rational decisions about survival. He was no longer sure he had been right about that. By the 6th hour, the Krethval had destroyed 11 human ships. The human fleet had destroyed over 200 Krethval warships and had reached the inner formation, where the command vessels sat. The chamber was completely silent. The Krethval command ships were the largest vessels in their fleet. Each one was roughly the size of a small continent, capable of sustaining damage that would have destroyed most other ships many times over. They were considered functionally indestructible by every military assessment the Conclave had ever produced. The Conclave's own strategic records contained a note, written 300 years ago by a Vorath admiral, that the only rational response to a Krethval command ship was to avoid engaging it directly under any circumstances. The unyielding Earth flew directly at the nearest one. Thas watched the display with his hands pressed flat against his knees. He watched the single large blue dot that represented the human flagship close the distance to the enormous red marker of the Krethval command ship at a speed that did not slow, did not waver, did not show any sign of hesitation. The Krethval command ship fired. The weapon it used was called a planet cracker in Conclave records. It had been used 14 times in documented history. Each of the 14 times the target had been destroyed completely. The weapon did not damage things. It ended them. The beam hit the unyielding Earth. The chamber erupted. Delegates were on their feet. Several species made sounds that their translators could not convert because they were not words, just pure involuntary noise. Thas was standing without knowing he had stood up. His data screen was on the floor. He did not notice. The display cleared. The unyielding Earth was still there. A third of its hull was gone. The readings showing its structural integrity were deep into the red. Several of its weapons systems had gone offline. Its speed had dropped significantly. One of its main drives was dark. It was still moving forward. It was still firing. The sound in the chamber changed. It went from the noise of shock to something quieter and stranger, something that did not have a clean name in most languages, but that every being in the room felt in the same place, somewhere below the rational mind, somewhere older. The unyielding Earth fired its remaining weapons at the Krethval command ship, not a controlled, precise strike. Everything, every functioning weapon system, all at once, in a single concentrated burst aimed at the same point on the enemy hull, a point that the ship's AI had spent the last 3 hours calculating as the optimal target. The Krethval command ship broke apart. The chamber did not cheer. It did not react with celebration or relief. It simply went very, very quiet, the way a room goes quiet when something happens that is too large to respond to immediately, something that needs a moment to settle before the mind can begin to process it. Drevik sat down slowly. He put his hands on his knees and stared at the floor for a moment. Then he looked up at the display and kept watching. The battle went on. It went on through the night and through the following day and into the night again. 37 hours in total from first contact to last. The conclave chamber stayed full for all of it. No one left. Food was brought and ignored. People dozed in their chairs and woke again and looked at the screen and stayed. The Krethval adapted constantly. They were never passive. They never panicked. They were, in every objective sense, extraordinary fighters. They found new formations, new angles, new ways to concentrate their fire. Several times they managed to pin groups of human ships between converging wings of their fleet and inflict serious damage. They were relentless and intelligent and vastly more numerous, and for long stretches of the battle they were winning in terms of raw tonnage destroyed. But they could not find the head to cut off. Every time they identified a human ship that seemed to be coordinating others and targeted it specifically, the other human ships simply kept doing what they had been doing. There was no moment of confusion, no hesitation while a new commander was identified and orders were relayed. The human ships just kept fighting, individually and collectively at the same time, in that messy, loud, deeply personal way that no conclave doctrine had ever described, because no conclave species had ever fought that way. In the 22nd hour, a group of 14 human ships found themselves completely surrounded, cut off from the rest of the fleet, with Krethval vessels on every side. The conclave analysts watching the display exchanged grim looks. This was a finished situation. Against any opponent they had ever observed, surrounded and cut off meant finished. The 14 ships attacked outward in all directions simultaneously. They did not try to escape. They did not try to hold a defensive position. They just attacked, each ship picking the nearest enemy and going for it with everything it had. And in the chaos of 14 ships attacking in 14 different directions, at once the surrounding Krethval force lost its shape, and the gap it had closed opened again. 12 of the 14 ships came back through. Thas had stopped trying to analyze what he was seeing. He had just stopped. There was no framework he had been trained in that could hold what was happening on that screen. He sat and watched and felt the thing he had been feeling since the corridor outside Osai's office shift and change and settle into something clear. It was not hope anymore. It was certainty. Quiet, solid, slightly terrifying certainty. When the 37th hour ended, the tactical display showed a human fleet of 114 ships, 27 lost, floating in the space where the Krethval advance fleet had been. The Krethval fleet was not retreating. It was not reforming somewhere distant. It was simply gone. 4,000 ships, gone. The chamber was silent for a long time after the display updated. Then Commander Osai, who had been sitting in her seat in the human section for the entire 37 hours without speaking, stood up. She walked to the communications terminal at the side of the room. She did not ask for permission to use it. She entered a frequency manually, a direct channel to the Krethval home system, bypassing the conclave communications network entirely. She waited for the connection to establish. When it did, she looked at the screen for a moment. Then she spoke. Her voice was steady. Her ship was burning somewhere out in the dark. 27 ships were gone, 27 crews, people she had known by name or known by the names of their parents and grandparents. Her voice did not waver. "This was your advance fleet," she said. "We know you have more, so do we. Send the next one if you choose to. We will be here. We will always be here. But before you decide, I want you to understand something clearly." She paused. "We did not enjoy this," she said. "We do not celebrate what just happened. Every ship we lost carried people who were born to build something better than war. They chose this anyway. They chose it because someone had to. That is who we are. That is what we are capable of when something we care about is threatened." Her voice dropped slightly, not with emotion, but with the particular weight of someone saying the truest thing they know. "We are very, very good at it, and we are very, very patient. And we will not stop." She closed the channel. The chamber behind her was absolutely still. She turned and walked back to her seat. She sat down. She folded her hands in her lap. She looked at the display, at the space where 4,000 ships used to be, and she breathed slowly and steadily, and she did not look like a person who had just won anything. She looked like a person who understood exactly what winning cost. 3 months passed. The galaxy did not go back to normal. There was no normal to go back to. The world that existed before the Krethval ultimatum and the 37 hours that followed it was gone, quietly and permanently. The way a thing is gone when you finally see it clearly for the first time and realize it was never what you thought it was. The Krethval did not send another fleet. For the first 2 weeks after the battle, the Conclave held its breath. Sensor buoys at the edge of Krethval space were monitored around the clock. Every unexplained reading was flagged and reviewed. Delegates who had finally gone back to their quarters to sleep properly woke at small noises and checked their data screens before they were fully awake. The fear did not leave immediately. It had been too large and too sudden, and large sudden things leave marks that take time to fade. But no fleet came. On the 19th day, a transmission arrived at Conclave headquarters from deep inside Krethval territory. It was addressed not to the Conclave, but specifically and directly to Earth. The Conclave communications team noted this with some discomfort and forwarded it to Commander Osai without opening it, because opening a message addressed to someone else felt unwise when that someone else had recently destroyed 4,000 of the sender's warships. Osai read it alone in her office. She read it twice. Then she sat for a while and looked out her viewport at the stars. The Krethval wanted to talk. Not negotiate. Not surrender in any formal sense. They used a word in their language that the translator rendered as something between acknowledge and reconsider. A word that apparently had no precise equivalent in any conclave language, because no conclave species had ever needed a word for the specific situation of an undefeated empire. Contacting a species, it had underestimated in order to discuss the terms of a future in which both still existed. Osai wrote back. She kept her message short. She gave a time and a communications frequency and said that Earth would be listening. When word reached the Conclave Assembly that the Krethval had initiated contact with humanity and that preliminary talks were quietly underway, the chamber produced a sound that was somewhere between relief and something more complicated. Relief was simple. This other feeling was harder to name. It was the feeling of a group of people who had been depending on walls they built themselves, discovering that someone else had quietly built a much larger wall around all of them while they were not looking, and not being entirely sure how they felt about that. Ambassador Drevik called an emergency session. It was not emergency in the crisis sense. The crisis, at least the immediate one, appeared to be passing. It was emergency in the sense that the conclave needed to talk about what had happened and what came next, and it needed to do that before the weight of it settled into the shape of something that would be much harder to address later. Drevik had been in diplomacy long enough to know that the time to have the important conversation was always now, never later, because later had a way of becoming never. The chamber filled, all 212 species, every seat taken. The low constant hum of the translation systems running across every frequency. The large central display showing a star map of the known galaxy, peaceful and detailed, with the region of the recent battle marked in the far lower corner in a small, quiet blue. Drevik stood at the central podium and looked out at the assembled delegates for a long moment before he spoke. 3 months ago, he said, this body was preparing to write a surrender document. We had reviewed the numbers, we had heard the assessment, we had concluded with what we believed was clear and rational thinking that there was no realistic path to resistance. We were wrong. He paused. We were wrong because we did not have full information. We did not know what humanity had been building. We did not know what humanity was capable of. And we did not know because we did not ask. Because we had decided, a long time ago, that we already knew what humanity was. The chamber was quiet. We called them a Class C provisional member, Drevik said. We gave them a seat in the back row. We smiled at their ambassador and told them politely that it would take 300 years for them to develop a competitive fleet, and we believed that we were being kind, because we thought we were managing their expectations about a reality they could not change. He looked down at the podium for a moment. What we were actually doing was telling them what we thought they were, and they listened. And then they went home and proved us wrong in the quietest, most thorough way imaginable. He stepped back from the podium. Commander Os walked to the center of the floor. She wore the same simple gray jacket she always wore. She carried a single data screen and nothing else. She stood in the place where, 3 months ago, she had told the assembled galaxy that humanity did not negotiate and did not retreat, and she looked out at the same faces that had looked back at her then with pity. Those faces looked different now. Some of them looked grateful. Some looked uncertain. Some, particularly among the older and more senior delegates of species that had been in the conclave the longest, looked uncomfortable in a way that had nothing to do with fear. It was the discomfort of people who had held a particular picture of how things were for a very long time, and were now being asked to let that picture go. I understood this. She did not hold it against them. "I want to begin by saying something clearly," she said. "What happened 3 months ago was not a human victory. I want that on record. 27 ships did not come home. Over 9,000 people are gone. They were not soldiers in the way that most of this assembly understands soldiers. They were engineers and pilots and doctors and children of engineers and pilots and doctors, people who were born into a project they did not choose and who chose it anyway, every day of their lives because they understood what it was for." She stopped for a moment. "There is nothing to celebrate in that. There is something to be grateful for. Those are not the same thing." She looked around the room slowly. "I am not here to ask for anything on behalf of Earth," she said. "I am not here to present a list of demands or to collect a reward. What I am here to do is make a proposal, a simple one, and I am going to ask this assembly to consider it seriously, not because Earth is owed anything, but because I believe it is the right structure for what comes next." She set the data screen down on the floor of the chamber and straightened up. "The conclave needs to change," she said. "Not its purpose. Its purpose is good. Bringing species together, building connections, managing shared problems, all of that matters. What needs to change is the assumption underneath it. The assumption that the galaxy is safe enough and stable enough, and that the beings living in it are reasonable enough, that protection can be treated as an afterthought. It cannot. What happened 3 months ago was not the first time a civilization has threatened this assembly. It will not be the last." She paused. "The conclave needs a permanent defense structure, a real one, not a committee, not a set of guidelines that each member may or may not choose to follow. A unified, standing, capable defense force with the authority and the resources to act when action is needed." She looked across the room. "Earth is willing to lead that structure. We are not willing to control it. There is a difference. Leadership means doing the work, carrying the weight, being the first to respond when something goes wrong. Control means telling everyone else what to do and keeping power for yourself. We are offering the first. We are not asking for the second." She let that settle. Every species in this room would have equal standing in the new structure. Every species would have representation in its decisions. No one world, including Earth, would have veto power over the whole. The murmuring that rose was not the murmuring of fear. It was the murmuring of people genuinely thinking. Then, from the Vorath section, a very old delegate named Sareth stood up. Sareth was one of the longest-serving members of the assembly, old enough that his silver skin had gone almost white, old enough that he had been in this chamber when humanity first applied for membership 40 years ago. He had been one of the delegates who voted to assign humanity Class C provisional status. He had thought at the time that it was the generous choice. "Commander Osai," he said. His voice was still strong, though slower than it had once been. "I will not pretend that what I am about to say is easy. I voted against full membership for humanity 40 years ago. I believed your species was too young, too volatile, too shaped by your history of conflict to be trusted with full standing in this body." He paused. "I was applying the wrong measure. I was looking at your history of conflict as a flaw. I did not consider that it might be a kind of preparation, that all those centuries of difficulty had produced something that we, who had not faced the same difficulties, did not have." He stood straight. "I want to ask a question, not as a challenge but as a genuine concern. You say Earth will lead but not control. You say all species will have equal standing. But humanity is now, by any honest measurement, the most capable military force in this galaxy. That is simply a fact. And history, your history, our history, the history of every species that has ever accumulated that kind of power, suggests that the distance between lead and control has a way of shrinking over time." He looked at her directly, How do we know that will not happen here? The chamber was very quiet. I looked at the old delegate for a long moment. Then she said, "You don't." The quiet deepened. "You cannot know that," she said. "Not with certainty. No structure, no document, no set of rules can guarantee it absolutely. What I can tell you is what we are, not what we say we are, what we have shown ourselves to be." She turned slightly, addressing the wider room. "Humanity has had power before. Many times in our history, one nation or group became significantly more powerful than all the others. Sometimes that power was used badly. We know that. We do not hide from it. But the story did not end there. Every time it happened, the rest of humanity pushed back. Every time someone tried to take everything, others stood up and said no. It is perhaps the most consistent thing about us. We do not like being told we have no choice." She paused. "If Earth ever becomes what you are afraid of, the rest of you will push back, and we will deserve it." And I genuinely believe, that the part of us that built Iron Covenant in secret for 40 years to protect people we had never met, that part will push back too. Soreth looked at her for a long time. Then he sat down slowly. He folded his white hands on the desk in front of him. He said nothing more. But after a moment, he reached forward and pressed the small green button on his desk that registered a vote of approval. It was the first vote cast. It was not the last. The final count was 198 in favor, 14 abstentions, 0 against. The 14 abstentions were not opposition. They were species whose internal governance structures required them to return home and consult their populations before casting a formal vote. Most of them sent word within the following weeks. By the end of the month, the count was 211 in favor, 1 abstention, 0 against. The single remaining abstention was a species called the Durath, who had abstained from every vote in conclave history on principle, and whose abstention was considered by all other members to be a form of agreement. The new structure had no grand name at first. It was simply called the Accord. Paperwork would follow. Committees would form. There would be arguments about funding and representation and the precise language of 100 different clauses. That was how large things were built. Slowly, with friction, with disagreement, and with the gradual understanding that the disagreements were part of the process and not evidence that the process was failing. Osei left the chamber when the vote was recorded. She walked alone through the long, transparent corridor to the outer observation deck, a wide, curved platform on the station's hull that looked out into open space. It was late by station time and the platform was empty. The stars were very bright out here, away from the interior lighting. She stood at the railing and looked out. Somewhere out there, the unyielding Earth was in dry dock being repaired. It would take 8 months to restore what had been destroyed in 37 hours. When it was done, it would not look exactly the same. It would carry the marks of what had happened. Dara Mensa and her team could restore function, but they could not restore the original, and no one had asked them to. The ship would wear its damage the way a person wears a scar, as information, as history, as proof of something survived. She heard footsteps behind her. She turned. It was Thas, the young Vareth aide who had spoken to her in this same corridor 3 months ago. He looked older than he had then, not by much but by something real. He stopped a few feet away and looked out at the stars alongside her, without speaking for a moment. Then he said, "Can I ask you something?" "Yes," she said. "When you walked into the chamber 3 months ago and told the whole conclave that humanity would not surrender, did you know? Did you know for certain that the fleet was ready, that it would work?" Osei was quiet for a moment. "I knew the fleet existed," she said. "I knew what it was built for. I had read every report, every assessment." She paused. "But no, I did not know for certain. You can never know for certain. War is not mathematics. People are not variables. I knew what we had built. I knew why we built it. I knew the people who built it and the people who crewed it and what they were made of." She looked out at the dark between the stars. That was enough to stand up. It is usually enough. Thas nodded slowly. He thought about this. "The rest of the galaxy," he said carefully, "spent 40 years thinking humanity was a minor member, a small, young, slightly primitive species finding its place. We had records of your history, of course. We knew you had been through wars, but we thought that was something you had grown past, something you had moved beyond. He paused. We were looking at it backwards, weren't we? Yes, Osai said simply. It was not something you had suffered through, he said. It was something that made you. She did not answer. She did not need to. They stood together in the quiet for a while longer. Below them, the station turned slowly in its orbit, and the planet Verath Prime moved beneath them, its blue-green surface lit by its star, its cities and oceans and deserts and mountains all going about the work of being a living world, unchanged and continuing, the way living worlds do when the things that threaten them have been turned back. That was the point, Osai thought. That had always been the point. Not glory, not power, not the satisfaction of being right when everyone said you were wrong, just this. Just the planet turning below them, just the lights on, just the world still there. That was what it cost. That was what it was worth. She pushed back from the railing and straightened her jacket. Get some sleep, Thas, she said. There is a great deal of work to do tomorrow. She walked back inside. The stars stayed where they were, cold and vast and indifferent, the way they had always been and would always be. And far out in the dark, in a dry dock orbiting a moon at the edge of the solar system, a great scarred ship sat in the quiet and waited to be made whole again. It did not seem to mind the wait. It had been built by patient people. It had all the time there was.